When Americans think about the origins of their oldest fortunes, they imagine steel barons and railroad kings, oil tycoons and banking dynasties. They picture men who built industries, connected continents, or struck black gold in Texas fields. But there is a darker story buried beneath the marble facades of Boston as Beacon Hill and the manicured lawns of Newport mansions. Some of America's most respected family names built their empires not on innovation or honest trade, but on something far more sinister. They got rich selling drugs to China. And the profits from that trade didn't just disappear into history. They became the foundation stones of American high society. This isn't ancient history. This is the story of how opium money built universities, funded museums, and established bloodlines that still shape American power today. The men who orchestrated this trade weren't outlaws or criminals in the eyes of their peers. They were pillars of their communities, church-going merchants who saw nothing wrong with flooding an entire civilization with addiction. And when the Chinese government finally said no, these same men helped drag America into conflicts to keep the drugs flowing. The opium trade wasn't just business. It was the first great American drug cartel, operating with government protection and social respectability. Now, if you think the war on drugs is complicated today, wait until you see how it all began. Because the real drug dealers weren't hiding in back alleys. They were sitting in boardrooms, building libraries, naming their children after the ships that carried poison across the Pacific. Let's start with a name that every American knows but few connect to drugs. Forbes. Yes, that Forbes. The magazine, the family, the fortune that became synonymous with wealth itself. But before Malcolm Forbes was collecting motorcycles and throwing lavish parties, his ancestor, Robert Bennet Forbes, was collecting something else entirely. Chests of opium bound for Chinese ports. Forbes wasn't just dabbling in the drug trade, he was one of its architects, a man who turned addiction into an art form and human misery into generational wealth. Robert Bennet Forbes entered the China trade in the 1830s when opium was already flowing like a river from British-controlled India into Chinese markets. The business model was brutally simple. British merchants grew opium in Bengal. American ships carried it to China, and Chinese addicts paid in silver that flowed back west. Everyone profited except the Chinese people, who watched their society crumble under waves of addiction. Forbes saw this system and didn't flinch. He saw opportunity. What made the American opium merchants different from their British counterparts wasn't morality, was efficiency. The British had to navigate the politics of empire, the regulations of the East India Company, and the diplomatic complications of ruling India while poisoning China. Americans faced no such constraints. They were freelancers in the drug trade, able to move faster, take bigger risks, and pocket larger shares of the profits. Forbes epitomized this approach. He built a fleet of the fastest ships on the ocean, vessels designed specifically for the opium run. The most famous of these ships was the Antelope, a sleek clipper that could outrun Chinese naval patrols and British competitors alike. Forbes didn't just own the ship, he captained it, personally overseeing cargo loads worth millions in today's money. Each voyage was a calculated gamble. The profits were enormous, but so were the risks. Chinese authorities had begun cracking down on the trade, seizing ships and executing dealers. Pirates prowled the shipping lanes, and storms could destroy months of investment in a single night. But Forbes had nerves of steel and an appetite for risk that bordered on reckless. By the late 1830s, Forbes had established himself as one of the premier American opium dealers in Asia. His ships carried thousands of chests of the drug each year, each chest containing enough opium to addict hundreds of users. The scale was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that Forbes alone was responsible for importing enough opium to addict tens of thousands of Chinese citizens. And he was just one player in a network of American merchants who had turned drug dealing into a respectable profession. But Forbes understood something that many of his competitors missed. The opium trade wasn't sustainable. Chinese resistance was growing, and the British were becoming increasingly protective of their market share. Smart money knew that the golden age of American opium dealing wouldn't last forever. So Forbes began diversifying, using his drug profits to invest in legitimate businesses back home. He bought shares in textile mills, invested in railroad construction, and purchased real estate in Boston's most prestigious neighborhoods. The opium money was being laundered through the American economy, transformed from the proceeds of addiction into the capital of respectability. The Forbes family wasn't alone in this transformation. Across New England, merchant families were making the same calculations. The Delanos, ancestors of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, built their fortune in the China trade with opium profits flowing through their counting houses in New York and Boston. Warren Delano, the future president's grandfather, spent years in Canton, managing the drug trade for Russell and Company, the largest American opium dealer in Asia. When Chinese authorities cracked down, Delano didn't retreat. He moved operations to more remote ports, bribed local officials, and kept the drugs flowing. His wealth would eventually help elevate his grandson to the presidency, though this connection was carefully downplayed in Roosevelt family histories. The Astors, America's first great real estate dynasty, also had their hands deep in the opium business. John Jacob Astor himself may have avoided direct involvement in drug dealing, but his ships regularly carried opium as cargo. His trading network provided the infrastructure that made the trade possible. When Astor invested his profits in Manhattan real estate, he was essentially converting drug money into American soil. The buildings he bought still stand today. Their value multiplied thousands of times over, all resting on a foundation of Chinese addiction. These weren't isolated cases. They were part of a broader pattern that connected America's emerging elite to Chinese addiction. The Cabots, the Cushings, the Perkins families all had fingers in the opium pie. Boston's merchant aristocracy was built on a foundation of Chinese misery, and they knew it. But they also knew that respectability could be purchased with the right investments, the right marriages, and the right charitable donations. The mechanics of the trade were surprisingly sophisticated for the 1830s and 1840s. American merchants didn't just buy opium and sell it in China. They created complex financial networks that spanned 3 continents. Opium was purchased in India with silver earned from Chinese tea and silk exports. The drugs were then transported to China on American ships, sold for more silver, and the profits were invested in Chinese goods bound for American and European markets. It was a circular system that generated wealth at every stage, with American merchants positioned at the most profitable points in the cycle, but the human cost was catastrophic. By the 1830s, China had an estimated 4 million opium addicts, a number that would double over the next decade. Entire regions of the country were economically devastated as workers abandoned their jobs to feed their habits. The Chinese government watched silver drain from their economy to pay for a product that was destroying their society. Local officials who tried to stop the trade were bought off or intimidated. Those who couldn't be corrupted faced smugglers who were better armed and better funded than the Imperial Navy. American merchants like Forbes weren't just passive participants in this destruction. They were active architects of addiction, innovating new ways to get drugs into Chinese hands and profits into American pockets. They developed new smuggling routes, cultivated relationships with corrupt officials, and even created primitive marketing strategies to expand their customer base. The opium trade wasn't just commerce, it was economic. Warfare conducted by private armies of merchants who had turned human weakness into a business model. And through it all, these same merchants maintained their reputations as upstanding citizens back home. They attended church, donated to charities, and sent their children to the best schools. The contradiction wasn't lost on everyone. Some contemporaries noted the hypocrisy of men who would never touch opium themselves, but had no qualms about selling it to foreigners. But criticism was muted, partly because the profits were so enormous, and partly because China seemed so distant that its suffering felt abstract. This moral blindness would have consequences that stretched far beyond individual fortunes. The wealth generated by the opium trade didn't just enrich a few families, it helped finance transformation from a colonial backwater into an industrial power. The Chinese government finally reached its breaking point in 1839. Commissioner Lin Zexu arrived in Canton with imperial orders to end the opium trade once and for all. He wasn't negotiating. He was declaring war on the drug dealers who had been poisoning his country for decades. Lin's first move was to surround the foreign factories where American and British merchants conducted their business. No one was leaving until every chest of opium in Canton was surrendered and destroyed. For men like Robert Bennet Forbes, this was the nightmare scenario they had always feared, but never quite believed would happen. The Chinese weren't just seizing a few ships or demanding bribes. They were dismantling the entire system that had made fortunes for a generation of American merchants. Lin Zexu didn't just want the opium that was currently in Canton. He wanted guarantees that no more would ever arrive. He wanted the foreign merchants to sign bonds promising that their ships carried no drugs. With the penalty for violation being death, the American response was swift and telling. Instead of accepting that their drug-dealing days were over, the merchants screamed about free trade and government interference. They painted themselves as victims of Chinese tyranny, conveniently forgetting that they had been systematically addicting millions of people for profit. Forbes and his fellow dealers didn't see themselves as criminals whose racket was being shut down. They saw themselves as legitimate businessmen being robbed by an unreasonable government. But there was a problem with their righteous indignation. The American government wasn't particularly interested in going to war with China to protect drug dealers. Unlike Britain, which had imperial ambitions in Asia and saw the opium trade as part of a larger strategic game, America had no territorial designs on China. American politicians were happy to let their merchants make money in Asian markets, but they weren't prepared to start shooting wars over it. This created a fascinating dynamic that reveals everything about how the opium fortunes really worked. The British fought the First Opium War from 1839 to 1842 using their navy to force China to accept continued drug imports. American merchants like Forbes couldn't rely on their government to fight their battles, so they had to be more creative. They became smugglers, pirates, and diplomatic manipulators, using every trick they could devise to keep their drug money flowing. The Treaty of Nanking in 1842 officially ended the First Opium War. But for American drug dealers, it was really just the beginning of a new phase. The British had forced China to open 5 ports to foreign trade, pay massive indemnities, and cede Hong Kong to Britain. But the treaty did unexplicitly legalize opium. It just made it much easier to smuggle by creating more ports and weakening Chinese authority. American merchants exploited these new opportunities with ruthless efficiency. They established operations in Shanghai, Ningbo, and other newly opened ports, creating a network of drug distribution that was far more sophisticated than anything that had existed before the war. The profits were staggering. Forbes alone was clearing hundreds of thousands of dollars per year from his opium operations, money that flowed directly into American banks and investment funds. But the most revealing aspect of this period was how quickly the drug money was legitimized. Forbes didn't keep his opium profits in some offshore account or hide his wealth from American society. He flaunted it. He built mansions, funded churches, and established himself as one of Boston's leading citizens. The transformation from drug dealer to philanthropist wasn't gradual or secretive, was brazen and public. Consider the timeline. In 1840, Forbes was personally supervising opium shipments that were destroying Chinese communities. By 1845, he was hosting dinner parties for Boston's intellectual elite, discussing literature and philosophy with men who would become Harvard professors and government officials. The same hands that had counted drug profits were now signing checks to fund hospitals and schools. Other American opium merchants followed similar paths. Warren Delanos used his drug profits to establish himself as a respectable New York businessman, investing in coal mines and railroads. The Perkins family channeled their addiction money into textile manufacturing and real estate development. The Cushings became patrons of the arts, funding museums and cultural institutions that still bear their names today. This wasn't just individual moral flexibility, it was systematic money laundering on a societal scale. American high society didn't just tolerate former drug dealers, it celebrated them as long as they invested their profits in respectable American enterprises. The Chinese, meanwhile, continued to suffer under the weight of addiction that American merchants had helped create and sustain. By the 1850s, opium imports had reached unprecedented levels. With an estimated 12 million Chinese addicts feeding a trade that generated tens of millions of dollars in annual profits for foreign merchants, entire regions of China were economically devastated, their populations too addicted to work, their silver reserves drained to pay for drugs. American merchants had become expert at exploiting this misery. They developed new varieties of opium designed to create stronger addictions. They established credit systems that allowed addicts to go into debt for drugs, creating cycles of dependency that were almost impossible to break. They even created primitive advertising campaigns, using Chinese intermediaries to promote opium use in regions where it hadn't yet taken hold. The scale of this operation was industrial. American ships were carrying thousands of chests of opium per voyage, with each chest containing enough drugs to supply hundreds of addicts for months. Logistics required to move this volume of narcotics across the Pacific were enormous, involving networks of suppliers, transporters, financiers, distributors that spanned 3 continents. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the American opium trade was its respectability. These weren't Bacali drug dealers operating in the shadows. They were prominent businessmen who conducted their operations openly, kept detailed records of their drug shipments, and even advertised their services in commercial publications. The opium trade had become so normalized in American merchant circles that dealing drugs was considered just another form of international commerce. The profits from Chinese addiction didn't stay in Canton, counting houses, or Shanghai warehouses. They flowed back to America like a golden river, transforming not just individual families but entire institutions that still shape American society today. Harvard University, America's oldest and most prestigious institution of higher learning, is built partly on opium money. The Perkins family, whose fortune came directly from drug dealing in China, donated massive sums to establish professorships and fund buildings. When you walk through Harvard Yard today, you're walking on ground purchased with profits from Chinese misery. The same pattern repeated across New England's educational landscape. Yale University received substantial donations from families whose wealth originated in the opium trade. The Russell family, whose Russell and Company was the largest American opium dealer in Asia, became major benefactors of Yale's growth. Skull and Bones, Yale's most exclusive secret society, was founded by William Huntington Russell, whose family fortune came from selling drugs to Chinese addicts. The connection wasn't hidden or denied, it was simply ignored, treated as irrelevant ancient history, even when the money was still flowing. Boston's cultural institutions tell the same story. The Boston Athenaeum, the city's premier private library, was funded by merchants who had made their fortunes in the China trade. Massachusetts General Hospital received donations from opium dealers who saw medical philanthropy as the perfect way to cleanse drug money. The irony was lost on no one who cared to notice. Men who had spent decades creating addicts were now funding institutions dedicated to healing and education. Most audacious transformation involved the railroads. The transcontinental railroad that connected America from coast to coast was financed partly with opium profits. The Central Pacific Railroad, which built the western section of the line using Chinese immigrant labor, was funded by investors who had made their fortunes selling drugs to China. Chinese workers, many of whom had fled their homeland partly because of the economic devastation caused by opium addiction, found themselves building American infrastructure for men who had helped destroy their country. The symbolism was perfect and perverse. Chinese hands built American railroads with money that came from Chinese addiction. The workers were paid a fraction of what their white counterparts earned, laboring in dangerous conditions. While the men who profited from their homelands, misery counted profits in comfortable offices thousands of miles away. When the railroad was completed in 1869, the ceremony celebrated American ingenuity and determination. No one mentioned that the project had been funded partly by drug money and built by victims of that same drug trade. Real estate provided another avenue for laundering opium profits. John Jacob Astor had shown the way, but the post-Civil War generation of former drug dealers perfected the technique. They bought entire neighborhoods in New York, Boston, and San Francisco, transforming drug money into American soil. The financial networks that had moved opium money became the backbone of American banking. The same institutions that had financed drug shipments to China began funding American industrial expansion. Banks in Boston, New York, and San Francisco that had grown rich on opium profits now provided capital for steel mills, textile factories, and mining operations. The Civil War accelerated this process of legitimization. Former opium dealers threw themselves into supporting the Union cause, funding regiments and purchasing war bonds with money that had come from Chinese addiction. Warren Delano used his drug profits to support Republican candidates and abolitionist causes. The same man who had spent years managing opium sales that destroyed Chinese families now positioned himself as a champion of freedom and human dignity. This was unhypocrisy in the traditional sense. It was something more complex and disturbing. A complete moral compartmentalization that allowed men to see themselves as righteous while profiting from human misery. The transformation became complete when these families began intermarrying with America's political and social elite. The daughters of opium dealers married the sons of senators and judges. The sons of drug merchants married into old American families whose wealth came from land or manufacturing. Each marriage was another step in the process of washing drug money clean, blending it with more respectable forms of wealth, until its origins became impossible to trace. By the 1870s, many of these families had achieved something remarkable. They had become more respectable than the old American aristocracy they had joined. Their drug profits had been invested so successfully, their philanthropy had been so generous, and their patriotism had been so visible that they were now seen as pillars of American society. The State Department became a particularly important target for these families. Men who understood China because they had exploited it for decades now advised American presidents on Asian policy. Their perspective was inevitably skewed by their history in the drug trade, but their expertise was considered invaluable. Former opium dealers helped shape American diplomatic strategy toward China for the rest of the 19th century, ensuring that American policy remained friendly to commercial interests, even when those interests conflicted with Chinese welfare. This influence extended into the 20th century through family connections and institutional relationships. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president, his family's opium fortune was ancient history, but the networks and institutions built with that money continued to shape American policy. Harvard professors, whose chairs had been endowed with drug money, advised the government on Asian affairs. Banks that had grown rich on opium profits financed American expansion into Asian markets. The legacy lived on, even when its origins were forgotten. The Chinese, meanwhile, continued to pay the price for American greed, long after the opium trade itself had ended. The addiction crisis that American merchants had helped create lasted for generations, destroying families and communities across China. The silver that had flowed out of China to pay for drugs left the country economically weakened and vulnerable to further foreign exploitation. The corruption that the drug trade had fostered in Chinese institutions became a permanent feature of the country's political landscape. The most chilling aspect of this story is how completely it disappeared from American memory. The families who had built their fortunes on Chinese addiction didn't just launder their money, they laundered their history, creating narratives of entrepreneurship and vision that erased any mention of drug dealing. Their biographers wrote about their business acumen and philanthropic spirit without dwelling on the source of their wealth. Their descendants learned family histories that emphasized hard work and moral character, while glossing over the opium years as a minor detail in larger stories of American success. This historical amnesia wasn't accidental. It was carefully cultivated by families who understood that their respectability depended on forgetting their origins. They funded historians who wrote favorable accounts of their ancestors. They donated papers to libraries that emphasized their legitimate business activities while minimizing their drug dealing. They created foundations and charitable institutions that celebrated their philanthropy while ignoring the source of their wealth. The result is an American elite whose power rests on forgotten crimes, institutions whose prestige comes from laundered money, and a national mythology that celebrates entrepreneurs who were actually drug dealers. The opium fortunes didn't disappear into history. They became the foundation of American high society, and their influence continues to shape the country today. So the next time you hear someone praise the vision and entrepreneurship of America's founding fortunes, remember the truth that history tried to bury. The Astors, the Delanos, the Forbes families didn't build their empires through innovation or hard work alone. They built them by turning human addiction into generational wealth. Today, when politicians lecture other nations about drug trafficking and moral leadership, they're standing on foundations built by the first great American drug cartel. When universities celebrate their founders and benefactors, they're honoring men who poisoned an entire civilization for profit. The opium fortunes weren't ancient history that faded away. They became the bedrock of American high society, and their influence shapes the country to this day. History doesn't repeat, but if you don't understand where your institutions really came from, you'll never understand how power actually works. The real drug dealers weren't hiding in shadows, they were building the America we inherited. If this opened your eyes to the stories they don't want you to know, hit subscribe. History has the answers if you're willing to look for them. Drop a comment and tell me. Did you know about the opium fortunes before this video? What other dark secrets do you think are buried in America's founding wealth? And if you want to understand how other American fortunes were built on exploitation and carefully forgotten crimes, check out the video on screen now about the railroad barons and the immigrants who died building their empires. Don't just learn history. Learn who benefits when history is forgotten.